He's watching. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. You will be seeing this later on as a recording, so it's not live for you, but it is definitely live for Robert and I. We want to wish you a pleasant day, whatever day that I decide to make this available for everybody. This is going to be a members-only stream, so do not worry too much about that. But with that being said, we're here to talk about all the recent shenanigans that are going on in Cuba. Robert reached out to me wanting to talk about this, and we finally got some time to do just that. So, Robert, how are you doing?
Good. How are you? I can't wait to talk about Cuba. I've studied a lot about Cuban history because I'm a historian and anthropologist in training, and with a focus particularly on 20th century, or what is sometimes referred to as the short 20th century, and the Cold War in particular.
Well, then it sounds like you're just the guy to talk to about putting a historical context in what's currently happening.
Yep. So I can't wait.
Well, things have died down a little bit since we're near towards the end of the month now. Things were really heated about 2 weeks ago in the middle of it all.
Yeah, it seemed like it was almost kind of like Arab Spring type uprising that I can kind of remember almost a decade ago.
Yeah, it's been 10 years. It started with Tunisia in late 2010, and then things really took off with the Libyan intervention in Egypt.
Right.
It has very similar vibes, although a lot of comparisons that we were talking before we went to start recording was that this has been made very much a reference to the special period back in the 90s after the Soviet Union collapsed. I know Newsweek did a piece on it. Time had made reference to it, CNN. A lot of American institutions are really trying to make this a sort of comparable, organic, this is a response to COVID, this is a response to the economic pressures because of COVID, nothing to do at all with any outside external factors.
Yeah, it's interesting how they mentioned that, because I was initially shocked by how they were blaming COVID for this, because Cuba was not distributing enough their vaccine. They apparently had their own vaccine.
Well, I think they had purchased the Russian one, if I recall correctly.
Oh, Sputnik, yeah. Well, that makes sense, because even though Russia is no longer communist, the Putin government is still doing a lot of economic and military deals with the Cuban regime.
Yeah. That, as well as that the country had received, this is from earlier this year, Al Jazeera had reported to the date the country had received 250,000 Russian Sputnik 5 vaccine doses, managed to secure funds to acquire 11.3 million doses. But that's just the relationship with Venezuela. And Cuba's accelerating as well to produce their own vaccine, but they are reliant on the Russians.
That makes sense. Initially, when the uprising began and it looked like it was getting really tense, I was thinking that maybe if it were to devolve into an open conflict, the Russian Federation would probably send in mercenaries of the Wagner group. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
I am not. Please enlighten me.
They're considered to be, in many ways, Russia's Blackwater group, but they're basically a group of pseudo-private militia who basically carry out the agenda of the Russian government. So, like, they've seen action in Ukraine, Syria, and Venezuela.
Well, that is another thing that I'm going to have to start doing my research on.
Yeah, and they've in many ways kind of replaced the role that old Soviet advisors otherwise would have during the Cold War.
Well, and it's funny because, like, Cuba, despite what's currently happening and then the crackdowns against protesters, and there has been a lot of concern that if, something were to actually happen or there would be a significant threat to the Cuban government, that Venezuela's government as well would have some problems, because there's a lot of Cuban advisors and security personnel that is helping the Maduro government crack down on its opposition.
Same thing, yeah, in Nicaragua, too. A couple of years ago, Nicaragua had similar protest uprisings. And there were refugees who came out of Nicaragua testifying that they heard both Venezuelan and Cuban accents from the security services there.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. And I mean, with the assistance of Cuban security advisors, the Venezuelans have managed to arrest opposition leaders and have pretty much Juan Guaido, confined to his home.
Yeah. Surprised they haven't just, killed him yet.
Well, I mean, I think it would be better to have him as leverage against the Americans who have been backing him now for both this administration and the entirety of Trump's term.
Yeah, exactly. And kill people too fast, that does irk a couple. It does get unwanted international attention.
Yeah. And plus, I mean, there's a lot of political aspects involved that comes out of the Americans, regardless of whether or not we get evidence that provides that this is both from the Americans trying to instigate a color revolution, which there has been numerous allegations that that's the case. But I mean, Biden has to tread this very careful line because he's looking at this, or at least his advisors. I don't know how much Biden is actually being involved with this, but he's getting. Well, yeah, his handlers, right? But I mean, he's getting a lot of pressure from like Florida Democrats that are like, listen, man, you need to play the party line here. You need to be tough on Cuba. He's put numerous sanctions on both individual leaders, but as well as the Cuban security forces. And he's considering changing the Cuban remittance policy for the first time in decades.
Oh wow, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, he said that he and his team, this was in a press conference, that they were considering changing the remittance policy so Floridian Cubans could finally send money back home.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you think the chances are that this is some kind of like a CIA color revolution type thing?
I'm always skeptical because it's just like, on one hand, the United States, for me, right, because I studied a lot of international relations during college. And so I read a great book about sort of just that there's this like virtually a century, right, of well, at least a half century, if I remember correctly, from like the 1890s to like the 1970s of just constant instigations, color revolutions, political advisors, and virtually everything being involved of the Americans in South America, which is why you hear the phrase from, whether it's Hugo Chavez or even Nicolas Maduro now about Yankee imperialism. So I do believe that there's some American presence involved. I don't know what geopolitical benefit it brings to the United States. We've been dealing with Cuba for a long time now. The fact that Biden is still maintaining a tough stance on Cuba, I think, is mainly for electoral politics. I think he would like to go back to the Obama sort of detente. But I'm not entirely 100% certain that this is an organic movement. Yes, I do think that there's some economic pressure, but I mean, they've got the vaccine from the Russians. They're trying to produce their own. They've got their own internal medical structure. They have their own sort of agricultural structure, which is one of the most unique forms of agriculture in the world. They're heavily reliant on worms to help fertilize the soil for what little agricultural sectors that they have for the island.
Really?
Yeah. But I mean, you'll hear people just talking about like, this is the worst economic crisis in 30 years. There's a lot of reference to the special period, but I mean, to me, it's very interesting to see the fact that, you've got everyone else in the world pretty much saying that this is an American intervention. And of course, when it's only the American media trying to portray this as an organic event, all fingers point to the idea that this is something that the United States government's doing.
Yeah, I think the Russians and the Chinese, and with the Russians in particular, they've spent the last 20 years of witnessing American-backed military interventions and American-backed, uprising movements like the Arab Spring and the incident that happened in Ukraine back in 2014, the Euromaidan protests. So I think that's kind of what is informing them in their media outlets.
Well, I mean, even earlier than that, you had color revolutions attempted in 2004. You had the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. You had pro-democracy efforts. The Bush administration allocated $500 million, I think, to help democratize Georgia, which, of course, the immediate response was the Russian military invaded Georgia.
2008, I remember that.
Yeah. But apparently, so I mean, the Global Times has an editorial talking about the U.S. blockade, the disruption of Cuba, a serious international crime. They argue that the demonstrations were triggered by current severe economic hardships, including a shortage of food and medicine and frequent power outages. Furthermore, Cuba's COVID-19 epidemic and prevention and control situation has taken a drastic turn for the worse. Cuba on Sunday reported the highest daily number of COVID-19 infections and deaths, with over 6,923 new cases and 47 more deaths. But no one believes that it's natural that the discontent over people's livelihood can be immediately led into the track of political protests. As Cuba's president Miguel Diaz-Canel said on Sunday, that the protests were a form of systemic provocation by dissidents doing the bidding of Washington, D.C.
Well, that's interesting because I do find it a bit convenient that these protests and uprisings happened not long after Raul Castro stepped down, and now you have this new guy who's running the country. So I think that's very fascinating and convenient.
Well, to me, I was about to say the timing is highly suspicious. Raul Castro steps down. I mean, Miguel was selected, in 2019, that he would succeed Raul in 21 when his term was finally up.
Yeah.
This
happens.
Say that again?
And this happens, the protests and uprising.
I know, it's just, a couple of months after he takes office? Because he took office in, April?
Yeah, I think so. April.
It feels incredibly planned.
Yeah, and I read, I actually remember seeing this video from a news outlet, Wyon, which is the Indian news service. Kind of interesting. I like to look at a lot of foreign news services, but they did they were talking about how there's been this report released from the Pentagon that showed the U.S. the Pentagon has a quote unquote secret army of 60,000 operatives throughout the world. So it wouldn't surprise me that a lot of them are in Cuba right now trying to stir up shit.
I wouldn't be surprised either. Let's see here, because we were talking before we went live was just the discussion over the security alliance called ALBA. I wanted to see what they had been saying.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a new alliance. It was established in 2004 between Cuba and Venezuela originally, and then it kind of expanded by 2006. So, and it includes a lot of micronations, but the four big players within that alliance is Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Bolivia. And all these countries are left-leaning, socialist, and Bolivarian in outlook, and they're generally allied with China and Russia, the Eastern countries.
Well, I also know that they're divested from the dollar. They have their own kind of currency that they used instead of relying on the sort of the dollar economy. It's like the sucre?
Yeah, and that could be something that why we're starting to have kind of involvement in Cuba, because a lot of our current economic system is dependent upon the petrodollar.
I mean, the United States has been seeing a lot of recent divestments from it being sort of the global reserve currency. I know earlier this year that Russia had announced that it's divesting off the dollar.
Yeah, and that could that be any way related to the inflation we're seeing?
No. I mean, the inflation is caused for two things. One, we have printed a significant majority of the money supply within the last 10 or so years, and that's finally coming to roost. And of course, we've been printing money like crazy in the wake of the COVID crisis. But to me, what's interesting is that the response, right, from the American government or the American media is that, we gave people all of this money through stimulus, and they're finally getting a chance to spend it as things reopen. I'm like, the little amount of money that was given to the Americans, a couple of $1,400 checks, is not going to cause what we're seeing now. And on top of the fact that, between supply shortages and our ongoing issues with China, the way that we calculate inflation has changed since the 1970s. We don't include the price of homes inside of Americans' modeling, or at least the American government's modeling of inflation. So they talk about inflation at 5.4, 5.6%. But if you were to include the increasing rising prices of home ownership, or how it would take to even own a home, inflation would be in the double digits.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I was thinking that maybe it had something to do with the Cuban uprising has something to do with the petrodollar and whatnot.
I wouldn't think so, considering that Cuba is highly dependent upon Venezuelan oil. Venezuela still has the world's largest global reserve of oil. So I don't think that I don't think the petrodollar plays too much of a role in it. But according to Prensa Latina, an agency for Latin American information, they did put out a article on the 26th from Caracas, which said the secretary for the Bolivian Alliance for Peoples of America and the People's Trade Agreement, Sacha Laurenti said on Monday that he highlighted the importance of the July 26 celebrations in Cuba. In a message on Twitter, the maximum representative of the regional entity pointed out that the date marks a transcendental milestone in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean, when a group of men first stormed the barracks to then take the sky by storm. His living examples are steps, glory to Fidel. Cuba on Monday celebrated its national rebelliousness, a date which recalls that on July 26, 1953, young men stormed the Macondo and Carlos Manuel de Cepedes barracks in eastern Cuba, sort of the start of the revolution. But I mean, they've also come out and condemned sort of the American response and the sanctions that have come out from the Biden administration, and they stand in solidarity with them, and they think that any sort of actions from the U.S. against the National Revolutionary Police and its main leaders is an international affront.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned Biden. I heard that Biden was possibly considering a military option.
There have been numerous protests called for a military option. You've had massive, and it feels incredibly astroturfed, to at least to an extent. I mean, one, there is, of course, the right-leaning Cuban voter that exists within Florida, which has been, swung like 15 points over to Trump in the last election, which is mainly why he, secured Florida as the swing state that it is. But at the same time, right, like you had numerous political who's visit Biden the other day, talking about Cuba and what needs to be done. So to me, it's just very interesting. Like the announcement came right before, this is from CBS. He says the announcement came right before President Joe Biden hosted Cuban-American leaders, including Senator Bob Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey, who's the Foreign Relations Committee chair in the Senate, Representative Gregory Meeks of New York, Manny Diaz, the chair of the Florida Democratic Party, along with a few other individuals as well. So, I mean, there's been calls from protests on the ground here in the U.S., especially in Florida, for an American intervention. To me, that reeks of like Grenada vibes from the 80s.
83.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, this seems very, very just, well, what are we going to do? Like, let's bring in all the people from the House and Senate Foreign Relations Committee and go from there.
Yeah, and it's interesting how I remember you were showing me a map of like all the protests, and like the closer they are to Gitmo, the more protests there are.
Yeah, let me bring that up so our future audience can see that, because I shared that with you. But yeah, I mean, considering that this is something that you've studied, especially the Cold War, I mean, what are your thoughts just in general of this whole, the reaction as well as the responses from the American government as well as the Cuban people?
Geez, I don't know. I mean, because it kind of does feel like in a way this is reminiscent of some Cold War tension, just without the ideological infighting. So I don't know. I mean, geez.
All right, let me put up that protest map now. Let me go share it. There we go. So yeah, now people can take a look at.
Oh, never mind. I got my Gitmo is on the viewer's western side.
Yeah, much closer towards Jamaica.
Yeah, I was thinking for some reason it was by La Habana.
No, but I mean, La Habana has been a very popular spot for people to try and leave and go to Florida. Although that's recently seen a significant reduction since towards the end of Obama's term, he ended the wet foot, dry foot policy.
Oh, that's interesting.
Well, I mean, that was purely for political reasons, I think, right before an election, that you're going to end a policy that could swing a major swing state towards your political opponent.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. They don't want people coming from Cuba because they vote more red.
Yeah, and I mean, why bother giving the odds of anyone trying to secure a victory electorally ever again, especially with the current, policies coming out of this administration?
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting how they're all the protests are kind of concentrated around La Habana.
Well, I mean, things have significantly died down since then. I mean,
yeah,
the Black Berets have come out, and the National Security Forces have come out. I mean, there's been reports of live ammunition usage, and as well as tear gas. So
Well, I think a lot of these countries, so-called authoritarian countries, they're not going to take any chances with so-called protests anymore because they've seen how, like in Ukraine and the Arab world, these protests get out of hand and become revolutions and then turn into civil wars like what we saw in Syria.
Yeah, I mean, no country with an anti-American slant is going to take any sort of protest movement as an organic idea. Like,
Yeah,
not at
but I
all.
feel like it was a little different in 2011 because even countries like Cuba didn't seem as harsh or repressive as they are now. If you catch my drift.
Yeah, it's true.
Because like even in the kind of 2000s, it seems like things were more laid back on the geopolitical stage.
But yeah, and I mean, there was a piece from the Atlantic I was reading earlier in preparation for our discussion. A professor from the University of Texas at San Antonio was sort of just talking about how, I've watched Cuba crumble from the inside.
Oh, I just saw that article. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, he talks about the revolution. He talks about 1994. He says, but his conclusion I thought was the most interesting. There are two paragraphs here I'm going to read for the audience. Today, there is a new generation of Cubans who grew up without the omnipresent figure of Fidel and the prying eyes of the state. To these young people, the old-fashioned socialist rhetoric still plays on state TV, is unconvincing, alien, and frankly ridiculous. Unlike my generation, they did not watch Soviet cartoons, but Disney and Pixar. They know the government has little to offer them. They want a political change, and they want it now. Instead of fearing walls with ears or tapped phone lines like my late grandmother did, they want to be heard. To ensure that they have taken to social media to amplify their voices. To be sure, though, Cuba remains under communist control, and the government might as well unleash its might at will, as the ongoing violent repressions and summary trials show us. But its totalitarian structures are irreversibly damaged. People sense the government's weakness and will continue testing its rusty chains. Those in power should acknowledge that their time is overdue, that they can't solve the country's never-ending economic and political crises with old formulas. They must open venues for liberalization before it is too late and the worst happens. A total collapse of the state and a civil war. And that last call for liberalization and then the threat of civil war, that just...
Yeah,
I don't know. That glows to me, friend. That glows.
Yeah, that's McWorldism writ large right there. I mean, I don't like communism either, but at the same time, lately, as an anthropologist, I also don't like how so many cultures have underwent this process, what we call McDonaldization, where their culture gets liquidated, not so much through violence and force, but through soft liquidation. The younger generation not caring about their the prior culture.
Yeah, I mean, to me, is someone who's more, reactionary and on the right. Like one of my biggest arguments back when I was in college, with Brexit and the vote coming up, was just always like national sovereignty matters more than virtually anything else. Like if you can't control the decisions of your own country and people's, then like what's the point of existing?
Also, many countries have underwent like economic and political liberalization, and they turn into total shitholes, like Russia in the 90s. Japan, when they became a multi-party democracy, they went through what was known as the lost decade. Mexico, when they became democratic, they now have the issues with increasing homicides and drug cartels pretty much ruling the country. So, I mean, I don't understand this mentality where economic liberalization is like the cure for everything.
Well, it's not a cure for everything, but it's a way to maintain hegemony for the West, or at least specifically the United States. For the longest time, up until the last decade, well, actually the last 20 years, I mean, trade liberalization, the whole idea of, free trade agreements, entering in these like free market solutions, very much the Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and even democracy. Yeah, I mean, the idea was that, if you liberalize the economy, that democracy inevitably comes with it. You had a lot of articles out of the foreign policy establishment in the mid to late 1990s talking about how, as the United States increases its trade with China, the People's Republic of China will become less communistic and in turn become more democratic. Now we know with the pleasure of hindsight that they were dead wrong. China, in fact, defended itself because every enterprise in China is a state-owned enterprise, and they'll execute billionaires if they dissent.
Yeah, and it's made the Chinese regime much more wealthier and technocratic.
Well, that and as if you go on Twitter, I mean, virtually everyone loves sharing that GIF of just the red versus blue of the United States and China and the world's like global trading partner, and how the United States has been eviscerated since the 80s.
Yeah, I've seen that too. Like it was a graph that showed the countries we were trading with in 2000. It was like most of the world, and then by like 2020, it was like reversed.
Yeah, the China's the global main trading partner for most of the world,
Yeah, and we're kind of confined to like Brazil and some Western European countries.
and
Even
that's
some,
about it.
even like Germany and Spain were like mainly trading with China.
Yeah, I mean, this shows that the liberalization has not held up, especially as the more impenetrable force has definitely taken in the world by storm. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more Chinese intervention, ever so subtly, come out of this current, ongoing in Cuba.
Well, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if the PLA gets dispatched there if they have enough power.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't expect the PLA, but I would expect some sort of political support, whether it's, financial relief due in response to American sanctions, or working through Venezuela and Russia to make sure that they get access to the material they need to maintain their regime.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Russia, like I said, would probably send in mercenaries of the Wagner group before China.
Well, let's see. Now that we're talking about that, we can just see what they're doing. Because yeah, let's take a look. Let's see what the news says. Ooh, okay. Well, Newsweek has an article about why the United States should be wary for calls of foreign intervention in Cuba.
Wait, what?
Yeah, no, this was from, let's see, a couple of days ago, I believe, is what the article was saying. Let's see.
And what's it calling for?
To be very wary for calls of foreign intervention. So this was done back on the 15th, so at the height of the protests.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. We do have a history of, just constantly intervening in Latin America.
Yeah. As the old saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. In the minds of many, it also comes with great expectations. With China's military modernization and Russia's proficiency in hacking and disinformation aside, they talk about the United States military still being one of the strongest fighting forces on the planet. U.S. commanders in a war room in Tampa Bay, Florida, can plan a mission against a hard target and watch it on their giant flat-screen TVs as U.S. special forces, bombers, and unmanned drones execute it quickly and proficiently. This military has won countless tactical engagements throughout history, whether it was like Manuel Noriega or the Wagner Group mercenaries in eastern Syria. So, I mean, we've been fighting the Wagner Group for a while. But in regards to Cuba, let's take a look here.
Yeah, I heard that we killed something like 200 of their mercenaries in Syria throughout the 2010s.
We have, yeah. It's not been. It's only made tensions worse, and I mean, it's a mess.
Yeah.
We keep poking the bear.
Yeah. But like I said, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, but I mean, keep in mind, right? Like they've had the Miami mayor up there to speak with Biden, and I mean, earlier this month, Miami Mayor Francis Suarez even floated the idea of American airstrikes on Cuba as a potential option that should be discussed. Sure, U.S. interventions, economic sanctions, embargoes, and covert plots on the island have been unmitigated failures for the last 60 years, but nobody likes to see ordinary Cubans beaten and arrested by corrupt, overweight enforcers of the Cuban government, right? But I mean, the article continues pretty much just saying, like, listen, the American government has a long and sordid history of foreign interventionism, whether it's Mogadishu or spending $2 trillion in Afghanistan. It is not a something that is very successful.
Or us promoting the so-called freedom fighters in Syria.
I mean, freedom fighters in I could do a whole stream on that, just talking about how we have freedom fighters in Syria that are funded by like the State Department and others that are funded by the CIA that end up shooting at each other. They're literally burning money.
Yeah.
But I think I said this on a previous stream, is that we're watching sort of the decline of any regime is when it starts focusing more inward rather than outward. And I mean, we're pulling out of Afghanistan, where we've announced a phased pullout in Iraq, and we pulled out of Somalia, our special forces operations last December. Like, it's an absolute mess.
Yeah, and we're making the NATO countries, many of which are EU countries, dependent upon Russian natural gas. So
Well, I mean, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was an inevitability. I mean, despite Americans trying to get the German Green Party to oppose it, I mean, we've seen the German government drift more towards Russia in recent years. Gazprom makes up like 40% of the European Union's energy supply. There wasn't much that the Americans, I think, could have done.
yeah, but did the foreign policy establishment not learn their lessons from the 1970s oil embargo?
Well, I mean, I think they did, because Biden reached a deal with the with Germany about that. We talked about that, I think, the other week, just discussing the fact that the pipeline has been is going to be finished probably by the end of next month. It's been sitting at like 95% completion due to American sanctions. And all that Ukraine got out of it was like $1 billion in like green energy funding. It was kind of a joke.
But yeah, as you said, it's odd that the American empire is kind of turning inward, and we see that also with the so-called all this like domestic terrorism legislation they want to pass.
Well, that's just a sign of decline. To me, this doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, when an empire starts turning towards inward problems and the domestic problems become its international messaging, which is why we're seeing like gay pride flags on embassies. We're seeing focuses on like race being exported everywhere. It's why like the UK is talking about it, Japan's talking about it. I mean, the pause is very real, and the fact that we're exporting it because America's greatest export is its culture and its culture war. To me, that's decline. When you're not focused on international issues and all that you have is empty rhetoric, then yeah, we're in that slow, gradual decline stage now.
Yeah, I think it's kind of their way of promoting the ideology of global homo before it collapses as much as possible.
And well, that's exactly where we're at.
Yeah. I don't know. It makes me sad because I remember like seeing old World War II propaganda where like they would show like a Nazi knife stabbing through a Christian Bible, and it would say with the caption, "This is the enemy," and that was like in the early '40s. But now it's like everything's pride flags and BLM signs on our embassies.
Yeah, I remember Jonathan Bowden gave a speech, I think it was like 2010, 2011. He's just like, if you were to ask all of the guys that were getting ready to storm the beaches of Normandy, like, this is what your country becomes, do you think they would have gotten on the boats?
Yeah. And I just think it's kind of sad. I mean, even though, I'm supposed to have resentment toward America, I mean, this is my home.
Yeah, it's always that. I mean, for most of us Americans, when we talk about these things, it's very hard to acknowledge that the government and the nation that you want isn't the nation that kind of exists anymore. And acknowledging that's a tough and bitter pill to swallow.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe this is kind of what the Cuba issue is about too, because Cuba is like our backyard. It is not the Middle East or Ukraine or Hong Kong or whatever. It's right behind us or below us. I mean.
Well, I mean, the rambling calls for intervention, whether it's from, Cuban Americans in Florida or even political leaders in Congress, it is a significant, departure from what has been sort of the democratic policy of the last, decade. Barack Obama, of course, had Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, say that, like, hey, man, the Monroe Doctrine is a thing of the past. That's not us. We're all about, more engagement, diversity, liberalization, and free trade. Like, our attention is not focused on the Americas. Our attention is focused elsewhere. Like, the Monroe Doctrine is history. And now you're seeing a much more tougher stance on Cuba and a stronger position there. I think a lot of this still has to do with the fact that Cuba is the sort of essential economic lifeline to Venezuela, both for political solidarity as well as for economic interdependence. Cuba provides security, intelligence, they purchase things, they have their doctors and medicine, and of course Venezuela provides energy resources and intelligence as well. Like I mentioned earlier on this stream, that Cuba has security advisors that help with the Maduro government. I do think that this is another angle of attack from the Americans to get towards Venezuela, because I mean, both Biden and the Trump administration have tried ardently to oust Maduro since Hugo Chavez's death.
Yeah, because Venezuela is interesting in the fact that it was originally kind of aligned with the West, but then when you had the Bolivarian Revolution, as they call it, in 1999, which brought about Hugo Chavez, it gradually aligned to the Eastern countries, Russia, China, etc.
Well, I mean, there's like I mentioned earlier. I mean, you have like decades worth of history of American interventionism in South and Latin America.
Oh yeah,
I would not be surprised in the slightest that you would want to try your best to reverse the McDonaldization of your country and, by extension, sort of undo the historical impact that the U.S. government's done towards yourself and your neighbors.
yeah. That's kind of what always annoyed me a bit about the left, where I remember growing up in like the 2010s and or early 2010s, and like the left would be kind of like they would think it's tragic that a lot of these third world cultures are getting liquidated because of Western capitalism and consumerism, but then like now they basically believe that economic liberalization is a requirement, so to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's see here. Like just 55 minutes ago from the local 7 News Miami, hundreds of people have converged in downtown Miami to take part in a rally calling on the U.S. government to take action to help the people in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. 7 News. There we go. Here,
all 3 of the major ALBA countries.
Yeah, all 3 of the major countries that are anti-American in South America and in the Caribbean. 7 News cameras captured attendees waving flags for Cuba, the U.S. flags, and other countries in a show of solidarity near the Bayside Marketplace during the Call for Freedom rally this Saturday evening. The overriding messages from the participants is that America needs to act. We are fighting for freedom, and this is what we're asking for. Freedom, says Julie Diaz. No vaccines nor food, only freedom. Oh, just that glows so bad.
I mean, like I said, I don't like communism, but I don't think the Cubans need McDonald's. I really don't think they need that.
I don't think that the American empire needs to be intervening and ruining yet another country. The Middle East is a fantastic example of why we shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, and especially in Latin America, where like it's so unstable, we could end up creating another like migration crisis and refugee crisis that's like 10 times worse than the European one in 2015.
Yeah, I mean, and all of this just screams, trying to cater to, at least for like Florida Democrats, right? A lot of this is just pandering to a base that they lost in the last election to a significant margin. Like Mayor Francis Suarez, who's a Democrat, I mean, they tweeted out earlier today, literally an hour ago, as long as we have a voice, we will use it to call for liberty for our brothers and sisters in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. As Americans, we have a moral obligation of standing up for democracy and human rights. That's exactly why we are here today.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical.
Well, I'm going to bring up my favorite quote from Carl Schmitt, because it's very, very applicable here. And let me go open up that image so we can. There we go. And I'll share screen. Let's see here. Alrighty, cool. But yeah, I mean, this is definitely an example of American imperialism in action. I think this is it. Is it? I'm not too sure, actually. Hold on. And share. Yep, there it is. Yeah. To quote Carl Schmitt, the concept of humanity is an especially useful ideological instrument of imperialist expansion, and in its ethical, humanitarian form, it is a specific vehicle of economic imperialism. Here, one is reminded of a somewhat modified expression of Proudhon's: whoever invokes humanity wants to cheat. To confiscate the word humanity, to invoke and monopolize such a term, probably has a certain incalculable effects, such as denying the enemy the quality of being human and declaring him to be an outlaw of humanity, and a war can thereby be driven to the most extreme inhumanity, end quote. And I've always said, if you replace the phrase humanity with democracy and human rights, it's literally the United States. Yeah,
I mean, the whole point of the American empire is the go around, chew people, blow people up who don't abide by its notion of liberal democracy.
I mean, that's been very much the American position. I mean, it's the evolution of sort of the Cold War mindset. Contain non-Western ideology, contain communism, promote democracy, promote trade liberalization, and we've just seen an evolution of that. I mean, we come out of the George W. Bush administration, you get things like the axis of evil, the promotion of freedom and democracy abroad.
I remember
all of this is a direct lineage of the Wilsonian idealism of the early 1900s and the 19 teens about, America will crusade for democracy. We will make the world safe for democracy. And that language goes on from Wilson to FDR to virtually every American president and administration from then till now.
Yeah, with the whole with patriotism going down in America, I wonder how long they could kind of maintain these this empire.
Well, I mean, that's why we're seeing the shift, right, from sort of the raw Americanism of George W. Bush and the sort of red America idealism of what the United States is to. I mean, we went into Afghanistan for what reason? We went in to disrupt Al-Qaeda and disrupt the Taliban and install a democratic government. And so, flash forward 20 years as the United States leaves.
Also secure the opium fields.
Well, yeah, and to curtail the drug trade, right, which eventually the CIA would use to fund its own projects.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
But I mean, 20 years later, in this radical acceleration of the culture, we're getting ready to pull out, and the establishment's like, no, what about all these women's schools? What about human rights? What about all these people that are going to be affected by the Taliban and their Islamic conservatism? So, yeah. I mean, the messaging has changed from like this is like a raw American feeling to we will promote diversity, we will promote inclusion, we will promote women's rights across the globe. LGBT. I mean, we even saw a bit of this pause in the Trump administration, where the Trump administration had Richard Grenell and others working to like decriminalize homosexuality worldwide.
I heard that. Yeah, they were bragging about decriminalizing homosexuality in like Africa.
Yeah, I mean, were places where these people would be stoned or hung or just outright killed. I mean, even now the Trump administration is putting that forward. I mean, we get pride flags on embassies. We've had BLM flags on embassies. So, I mean, we've seen the modus operandi of the regime change very rapidly from a sort of a nationalistic, prideful stance to a international, everyone is almost like John Lennon's Imagine.
Yeah, but who knows how many countries America could take out on its way down?
Well, considering that the UK is, embroiled in its own versions of the culture war, Canada is engaging in a similar discussion over reparations. I would say some of our closest allies are already coming down with us.
Yeah, and I do understand countries like Russia and China not wanting the pause in their country.
Nope, not at all, and they'll resist it quite equally and fairly to a point where you'll have Chinese government officials on Twitter mention some very no topics that I won't bring up on YouTube for the sake of keeping this channel afloat, but they will criticize organizations like the ADL and others.
Oh yeah, and I heard that amidst the falling birth rate in China, the Chinese government literally just banned feminist groups. They've
banned feminist groups. They've banned LGBT groups on like the internet and like vast versions of group chats.
Which is ironic because China is an atheist state.
I mean, but here's the important thing to realize, right? Even if China is technically an atheist state, all countries and governments have some form of theocracy.
That's true. Yeah.
They all have a governing ideology and religion. Up until maybe the last 50 some odd years or so, the United States' governing ideology and religion was sort of the American mythos of the founding. You had a people that managed to conquer the continent and conquer the world, and now that's changed. America's founding
Protestantism too.
Yeah, liberal Protestantism, and I mean, and now that's definitely changed, where it's sort of this secular, like we don't believe in Jesus, but we're going to take along all of the doctrine of Jesus and we're going to apply it to race. The civil rights era is America's like founding. So I mean, the governing ideology exists of every country, and I mean, if you want a good example of China, and what their sort of governing ideology is, I would highly recommend that anyone in the audience, if you haven't read it by now, you need to read Xi Jinping's like 2014 report of what he wants to do for China. You can pick it up online in English. And I mean, it sort of really outlines what he wants to do for the country and outlines sort of what the Chinese vision is. It's sort of this bizarre mix of like Confucianism and legalism, but very much a law-based order rather than sort of the Western rules-based order that we see here.
Yeah, it's kind of like pre 1949 China, but at the same time, there is still a lot of that Maoist influence still left.
Oh, very much so. And I mean, and they'll pay lip service to it, especially as they have, their state-owned enterprises. They manage their Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, very much the idea, at least out of the Chinese, and I know this is an aside, but I mean, China, of course, is going to support the Cubans anyway, is that, they do not want a repeat of what they call the century of humiliation. They are very much on a road to sort of assert themselves as a global hegemon, and they're going to do whatever they can to ensure that they're not taken out on the way down.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of goes back to like me mentioning how they ban feminist groups, because if they get the importation of lifestyle values, which states that having a family is it's secondary to people's primary materialistic lifestyle, that would collapse the society within a generation or two.
Well, I mean, China's already got a huge demographic problem, whether it's aging population or its vast sex disparity between the sexes. I mean, there will be an issue in a generation or two for sure.
Yeah, but it would happen even worse and faster probably if they did have that like Western style pause feminist liberalism.
Most likely, yeah, and which is why I think China's strategy, at least globally, right, is sort of just like do what it can to agitate and further accelerate American decline culturally, so you don't actually have to fight a war.
Yeah, exactly.
That way you're somewhat in a position of power before your own problems rise up.
Yeah, exactly. And, we're kind of doing that to ourselves, though, I think.
We are. We're not making it, we're making it very easy for countries like Russia and China to do exactly what they want to do.
Yeah.
And, but so you said you're an anthropologist in training, and so
yeah, I'm an anthropologist and historian in training.
So with that being said, not to with your sort of subject matter experience then with anthropology, I mean, regardless of American proponents putting up a lot of what's happening in Cuba, I mean, do you see sort of the argument about a younger generation? Does that make sense to you?
Younger generation being like more liberal in Cuba?
Yeah, and being less sort of Cuban identitarianism and maybe sort of that global citizen liberal view.
Maybe that does influence a lot of like the urbanites in Cuba, like those living in Havana, but I haven't seen a whole lot of hard evidence that that's the majority of the Cuban population. I mean, these people are kind of insulated from outside influence for the most part, but I'm not, totally I'm not totally going to put it off the table. I mean, it's possible.
I mean, from a culture perspective, I mean, historically, Cuba's been relatively impervious to sort of the cultural influence of the West, both due to, say, the embargo that the United States has had since Kennedy, and I mean, they've been primarily trading with, anti-Western countries, so I doubt they've had much exposure to sort of cultural influences outside, maybe from illicit trade and materials.
Yeah, exactly. Because in Cuba, I mean, the people still drive like these old cars from the 1950s, which is, I think, actually kind of interesting because, to make a long story short, my mom actually went to Cuba in the 80s. She wasn't supposed to, make a long story short, but she talked about how the culture there was like so, how do I want to say, old school, but like the people were really happy and they were really in touch with their culture, the Cuban identity. So I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense.
No, it does. To me, it does. Well, with that being said, I mean, if you could, with your sort of historical and anthropological sense, like what would you consider to be the Cuban culture, at least now in 2021?
To be fair, I haven't really studied a whole lot of Cuban culture. My study has been on different cultures within academia and what I've gotten in training. I would have to study more about like what the Cubans actually what the Cubans actually consider to be their culture, so to say. But I definitely think that I definitely think that it's more shielded against like I guess you could say the Western global homo ideology.
I would be inclined to agree with you there, especially because so much of this has been very much, just influence from. I mean, the internet has been shut down there, so I mean, access to, international statements and calls for help have been cut off, which is, I mean, good for the Cuban regime in managing to shut things down. I did find the international response to that kind of funny, especially the American response. The internet's access to the internet is a fundamental right, and the ability to communicate and engage in like democratic systems. And it's like, yeah, we don't have that here.
Didn't Nigeria do something like that? They banned Twitter, and Twitter
they banned Twitter.
Yeah, and Twitter was like, they considered access to Twitter to be like a human right.
Yeah, access to social media for people to voice, their concerns in a democratic system. They're highly concerned with Nigeria's doing. But I mean, like,
which translates to basically they want the social media to decide who their presidents are going to be.
Well, I mean, as we learned from like all the aftermath from like the 2016 election here in the U.S., like social media can make or break an election.
Exactly. Yeah. Speaking of the Cuban culture, I forgot to mention. I have studied a lot about religious history and religious policy under totalitarianism, and so I did study a little bit about Cuban religiosity during the communist period, and it's kind of interesting because Fidel Castro was originally kind of like liberation theology minded, but after the Bay of Pigs invasion in '62, I believe, he turned against all religion and endorsed kind of like a Soviet-style state atheism policy. So, most of the priests were arrested, churches are shut down, and that policy continued up until about 1992, where it broadly became more of a secular state. So that's had an effect on Cuban religious cultural identity.
But I mean, at the same time, right? Cuba's like what, 60 some odd % Catholic as well?
Yeah, on a nominal level.
And they've got their own Cuban Bishops' Conference and everything. So I mean, I would imagine that if I were to make any sort of predictions, right, that there would be a religiously themed sort of push for rebellion or some kind of push for protests under a Catholic guise to gain popular support.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, you can kind of whip up some right-wing hysteria about that because of, the history of godless communism. But I don't know, it's kind of interesting. Cuba, it's like the least repressive toward religion of all the communist states that still exist. So
I would be inclined to agree, considering what few communist states or socialist states still exist. They're definitely one of the most liberal on that issue.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can also see why, the biggest issues, right, is that we're seeing like this hardline position from the Biden administration, I think mainly for political reasons, especially for Florida. But then secondly, right, there's these two other fronts that I'm concerned about. The one, of course, being Venezuela. This is sort of an alternate front to put up in regards to trying to oust Maduro. And then, of course, the other concern is going to be China, because China definitely uses Cuba as a platform for intelligence.
Yeah, like I said, it's kind of it's a Cold War scenario just without
the Soviet Union.
Yeah, without the Soviet Union.
I mean, let's see here. Joseph Humayer, an executive director for the Center for a Secure Free Society, told Newsweek that China uses Cuba as a platform for many of its regional intelligence and security operations. This includes signals intelligence stations used to intercept communications in the United States. He's referring to the Lord's facility just west of Havana that was once operated by the Soviets, which is now operated by the Chinese. He continues saying that China's relationship with Cuba was truncated following the Sino-Soviet split, in which Cuba allied with the Soviet Union. Following the fall of the Soviet Union and a dramatic withdrawal of Soviet subsidies from Cuba, China strengthened its relationship somewhat by stepping into the breach.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, for the last couple of years, along with Venezuela, China's the second largest benefactor to the Cuban regime. China helped build the Cuban internet infrastructure. It's pretty much all based on Huawei technology. And the telecom stuff is ZTE. So, I mean, virtually, I mean, all Chinese traffic or internet's, technology and infrastructure is in Cuba, which I think is why it was so easy for President Diaz-Canel to just shut down the internet overnight.
Yeah, I heard that Russia has the same access to do the same thing to shut down the internet there.
Within Cuba or their own country?
Their own country.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest. I know Egypt did something like that back in 2011 in regards to during the time of the Arab Spring as well. So, I mean, I think Turkey has the same ability as well. I know during the attempted coup in like 2015 that some parts of the internet were shut down in Turkey. So, I mean, it's very common that we see in a lot of Western skeptical regimes to have the ability to control the flow of information.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. The current intelligentsia doesn't consider that many countries in the East, like Russia, Turkey, Hungary, all those countries, they're operating more from a civilizationist paradigm rather than a liberal democratic rights paradigm. They don't seem to understand that. I don't see why, because that would better their understanding of these countries.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you've read Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations.
Yeah, I've read that.
Okay, yeah, I firmly adhere to a lot of what he has to say there. I do think that a lot of these things are based on civilizations. And I mean, you can weaken a civilization, of course, by making it far less, homogenous. So, I mean, that's why you see a lot of these countries that are, I think, civilizationist based, whether that's Russia, whether that's China, at least Han China. And even Turkey, right? Like they're trying to maintain themselves as a civilizational state. Turkey sees itself as the eventual successor to the Ottoman Empire, right? They're trying to ethnically cleanse the Kurds out of the eastern part of their country. They've been waging a war with them since like the 1970s. So to me, I'm not surprised in the slightest that we're seeing a lot of these things happen. There is a civilizational identitarian aspect that doesn't exist anymore in the West.
Yeah, because we've replaced it with just pure liberalism.
And we are seeing the consequences of liberalism failing in action.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of, you mentioned Samuel P. Huntington and his Clash of Civilizations theory. I've read that and I go by a lot of it, but I also go by another author who, his name is Benjamin Barber. He wrote a book called Jihad versus McWorld, How Globalism and Tribalism are tearing the world apart, I believe is the subtitle.
Yeah. I remember I read that in college. It's been so long.
Yeah, and so anyway, his thesis was that basically you have the neoliberal economic system, which is represented by liberal democracy, going against highly traditional cultures throughout the world, which is represented by jihad. Neoliberalism is represented by McWorld, and that's why there's a lot of tension between these kind of two outlooks.
Oh, I mean, definitely. And I mean, the one thing that like a lot of like libertarian or at least anti-war commentators on the right and left talk about, I remember Rand Paul gave a speech, I think back in like 2015. He's just like, you can't turn a Saddam Hussein character into Thomas Jefferson and expect them to have a McDonald's. Like,
yeah.
And I mean, and people are going to respond to that. I mean, I'm not going to refer to an open letter that was published back in the late 1990s, early 2000s era from a certain OBL character, but I mean, outlining sort of the social decay and the economic issues and the cultural deprivation that comes with engaging with McWorld globally. He, looking back, he certainly has a point.
Yeah, exactly, and that's something I don't like about the McWorld system, is that it does liquidate all these cultures that, I do think have a right to pass their cultures on to the next generation.
Well, they should, and that's fundamentally the problem, I think, that comes with sort of the liberal universalism that has become commonplace both here in the United States and Western Europe, is that no, everything needs to be the same, everything needs to have sort of these similar ideas, similar values, similar products that we can purchase. You get of course, I think it was Thomas Friedman who was talking about like no two countries with the McDonald's in them ever bomb each other, which of course was like 4 days before his theory gets disproven as like the issues in Bosnia happened in like 1994. So,
yeah.
But I mean, but that's such a commonly held belief is that, trade liberalization causes the less likelihood for conflict. When we can democratize, it's not going to be a problem. despite the fact that economic interdependence and the fear of one country becoming more powerful than the other in this interdependence usually causes conflict, which is why people look back to like England and Germany, at the start of World War One, concerns over the United States and China right now. To me, anything that sort of offsets the balance of where you stand in the world is always going to cause issues. And trying to change the national makeup or trying to change the national government and the governing ideology of that government through universalism and liberalism is always going to cause a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Because I always go back to like what I was saying. How I remember watching these documentaries in college and thinking that, or these documentaries where they would focus like on some indigenous tribe in the Amazonian region, and how like their parents were highly traditional. They wanted to pass on the culture to their children, but these indigenous children had no interest in the culture and the lifestyle of their parents. They would rather be eating McDonald's and watching Western television and wearing Western clothing.
Well, I mean, to me, I always point to the example of like American Samoa and like Tuvalu, who have some of like the highest obesity rates per capita in the world.
Yeah.
Like they're so fully dependent upon like Western fatty foods that their bodies were just not developed for after years of being alone on an island. Like they're just, it's depressing. Like this is the state of where we are with American McWorld and globalization.
Yeah, and at least before, I mean, I don't like some of how Christianity handled some of these conversions, but at least that was better than, the obesity, the fatty foods from McDonald's.
I mean, at least Christian missionaries brought upon, literature,
Yeah,
literacy, education, clothing. I mean, yeah, there's some things that are rightful and able to be criticized of it, but I mean, that was far better than this sort of secular McWorld, go eat your burger, go watch your, Netflix show on your iPad, and go, eventually eat the bugs and get in the pod.
Yeah.
But I mean, it just shows sort of the international pressure to sort of end it all. I mean, even from the Western countries, you'll get it like back in June, I think it was, the UN General Assembly for like, what was it, year 30 now, I think it is. They told Washington, like, end the Cuban embargo. And I mean, I don't see that happening anytime, despite the fact that Biden campaigned on it.
Yeah, I don't see that happening either.
I mean, Biden is too concerned, I think, about keeping Florida for Kamala Harris in 24 to really do anything about it.
If he's even cognitively there.
I don't think he'll make it to the end of his term. That's been my position since just watching him go just nuts when he talks.
Did you see the video where like he said, "I've had my butt wiped"?
It was pure gibberish. I couldn't tell you what on earth he said. I do, but I mean, someone said that that's what he says, and then you hear whatever the caption was. I did see it though. I do think he was just simply making fun of the fact he couldn't hear anybody from the helicopter in the background. But
I know I saw fact checkers, quote unquote, were saying no, he didn't say that, but like. You just listen to the video; it sounds like exactly that.
Oh, absolutely!
And there's even a woman in the background who laughs shortly after, like what she heard was, "I've had my butt wiped."
I mean, I don't think he'll make it to his end of his term. So I think he's responding to pressure from Democrats in Florida, being like, "Listen, if you want to maintain a Democratic White House, through quote unquote legitimate means, then you need to convince these people to vote for you," which is all of the Floridians that went to Trump.
Yeah, do you think they're gonna fortify the election in 2024 like they did this one?
I mean, America has always had a lengthy. I'm going to try my best to be very careful now because this is.
I probably should shut up about that.
Yeah, I don't want to. Let's see here. America has a very long and sordid history, from the very first election in 1788 to Boss Tweed, to what happened in 1960 with the mafia in Illinois, to what happened just recently in that Time magazine article of electoral shenanigans. It is as American as the Stars and Stripes and apple pie and baseball. So do you think that they would stop after one? No, they'll probably do it again.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm going to leave it at that before any of the algorithm or bots come after me.
Yeah, and I think the people like David French, they want to tell the conservative base that the reason why they lost is because they did choose a populist candidate who was quote unquote illiberal.
despite the fact that he gained more votes, in a second election than any other like Republican candidate in history.
Yeah,
I mean, even the famous 1984 landslide for Reagan, he didn't gain nearly as much as what Trump did.
right.
So I mean, hey, whatever. If you had a guy, and then here's the thing: this is where the more I start reading into it, the more I kind of think that this is where Yarvin's right, and this is sort of an aside. But like, if someone were to just come out and say, like, I'm going to end all this, and that's all I'm going to do, sort of the Cincinnatus kind of Caesarian moment. Yeah, that would be game over. If someone said, I'm going to end this crap in the schools, I'm going to like end all this crap that's going on here, and we're going to stop doing X, Y, and Z that everyone hates, then yeah, I think that you would have someone with a substantial amount of power very quickly getting into the reins and seats of power.
A Caesar-like figure.
Yeah, and I mean, there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Linker who put out a great article saying, like, the Claremont Institute is flirting with Caesarianism, like, and Moldbug put out a really great piece today in response to it on Grey Mirror. I think everyone should read it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was very quick, and it was very, very sassy for Moldbug's writing. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, it seems like they're trying to create this new national mythos from this, what happened on the 6th of this year.
Well, I mean, you've had a combination. So like there's this like weird sort of like, and I talked about this in my most recent scripted video about like this is the hill to die on, or not the hill to die on. Like after like the Derek Chauvin trial, right? You had people having baptisms where George Floyd died. Sort of this cultural, spiritual rebirth that just sort of cannibalizes the old religion of Christianity. So I mean, you have this mythos about, of course, what happened on the 6th. You have this mythos about race, which is sort of the logical conclusion of the civil rights era. I mean, and of course, everything is about like this disparate impact sort of deals. Like, I work with a group that does a little bit of federal funding, and I had like training on procurement the other week. And like the first half of this like 4-hour like Zoom meeting was about, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and you have to measure disparate impact, and you have to talk about how this affects low-income people and minorities, but minorities technically matter more when you're doing X, Y, and Z, because low-income people can also mean white people, and it's like, Jesus Christ.
It's so confusing. In my state, California, there was this like
God rest your soul.
Yeah, there was this like legislation introduced that they wanted to introduce like social justice like propaganda basically to the math courses.
Well, that's okay. The American Medical Association today was just like, no, you need to stop having listing sex on the birth certificate. It's not important.
Oh gosh. And then, they say that people on the right are you'll hear like the Washington Post right op-ed saying how the Republicans are the party of unreality.
But I mean, reality doesn't matter to these people. I mean, it has always been about the emotional impetus about how you feel, and where you identify along the lines of. That's why there's no positive role model for masculinity amongst the left.
Yeah, I saw your video talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, it just doesn't exist. But yeah, I mean, I do think that a lot to sort of wrap up on this Cuban discussion, because we have been veering off on other topics. Me, I do feel like these protests are partially organic due to the economic issues. I mean, you've been reliant on more or less 3 countries, Russia, China, and Venezuela. There's still been, widespread shortages and squeezes on the supply chains internationally. I wouldn't be surprised that there's some sort of domestic, protests and access to Western media that may cause that. However, I do think that this is once again a proxy conflict between the United States and those said powers. I mean, it's a front for pushing, getting pressure on Maduro, because it's been a long-standing objective to get him out for a variety of reasons, primarily oil. Security concerns to get rid of the Chinese listening posts and access to Chinese, security services there. And of course, to, cut off another country of trade between Russia and Cuba. I think it's a great way to intervene, as well as, the hard line position from Biden trying to make sure that Kamala in 24 or whoever succeeds him has a quote unquote swing state to win from, Cuban voters.
Yeah, and I definitely concur with that too, because like I said, I read that the Pentagon has a secret army of 60,000 operatives. It would seem ludicrous to me that a lot of these operatives aren't in Cuba trying to start some kind of quote unquote Facebook revolution, as they're called.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest. I mean, the United States has been doing that globally. I mean, whether it's in, they're trying to do it in Belarus. I mean, all of the EU is
Even
putting
years after
pressure
the
there.
Cold War, even years after, or decades now that the Cold War has ended.
Well, I mean, that we could go on a whole long spiel about like American Western expansion into Eastern Europe and the Russian response to it. But I mean, we color revolutions in Ukraine, both in '04 and like 2014, 2015. I am not surprised in the slightest that there would be something happening in the United States happening there.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, I haven't watched the John Doyle video, so I'm going to have to go through that because I think it's like, what, 38 minutes long of him just like, connecting all the dots about how this is like happening from the CIA's perspective. So that'll be the next thing that I watch. And I will link it in the description for everyone who is watching this at a later time. Because if you haven't seen that John Doyle video, you should. He's great. He's one of our guys. He's fantastic. So yeah, I will definitely put that up for y'all to watch.
Sweet. Yeah, I saw that.
It's in my queue. I'm currently going through the last cigar stream over Rothbard and Children.
Nice.
Yeah. Between reading and then everything else that I've been doing, like I'm trying to finish Bertrand de Juvenel's On Power so I can do prudent reads. Like I'm very much behind.
Yeah, I'd love to talk sometime about like some of what I do with anthropology because it's a fascinating topic.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't study anthropology in college. I studied, foreign relations, and I studied early American history, specifically the American Revolutionary War and the Constitutional Convention, and of course the Confederation Articles. So yeah, that's definitely an area that I'm not familiar on. I would love to have you on again, especially when you're more in depth on your area of study.
Yeah, and I also do a lot of history. That's also what I've studied too in college.
Well, I mean, you should get in touch with AM sometime in the future when he decides to start back up again, because he is the go-to history guy for me. I've learned so much about European history from him.
Yeah, nice.
But yeah, I mean, there's so many strings and foreign policy actions going on from this administration over Cuba. I wouldn't be surprised if eventually talks of intervention does eventually become policy.
Maybe not to sound too conspiratorial, but we've seen all these like woke army ads. Maybe this is the way the government's trying to get young progressives in the military to fight for something.
Oh, I know. You were telling me about one ad about how like this person has two mommies. Like,
yeah, Sarah.
I mean, I've seen animated ads for the army where it's like there's like a lesbian wedding, and then
that's
like
who I was talking about. Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Oh my goodness! I just cannot believe that this is where we're at.
Like I said, because like how are you going to get young progressive Zoomers and millennials in the army? Well, you have to put a rainbow flag on it.
Well, this is on top of the fact that like 70% of like millennials and Zoomers are either mentally ill or too fat to even serve.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and they've also, from what I've heard, they've also reduced a lot of the physical requirements for the military.
Oh, they have. I know that the Air Force fitness test, they can now like walk instead of run their 2 miles or whatever.
They did the same thing with the Army.
There was some Reddit post about it that I'm gonna have to find and send it to you in the DMs, where this guy was like, "You guys, you need to walk it. I got the worst shin splints ever." And it's like, oh my god, these are the evil men and women who are willing to do evil on my behalf so I can sleep soundly at night. Like, oh god.
Shoot, I probably did more exercise in high school than some of these.
Yeah, oh boy.
Yeah, and I heard that the Marine Corps, they got rid of the shark tank. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
They did? That's a surprise.
Oh yeah, there was a YouTube, like a former Marine, I forget his name, but he was talking about it, how they got rid of the shark tank. And I saw this video about like the U.S. Army doing their where they're supposed to jog and sing. Instead,
their cadences, yeah.
Yeah, they're walking.
I saw that one too. That was, oh yeah,
How are these people? How are these people going to go up against a trained Russian soldier who's been taught to just destroy the enemy?
I don't know. Like I grew up as an army brat. I don't want to think about what that institution has turned into.
Yeah,
it's very blackpilling.
exactly.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Robert, if you have anything that you would like to shill or promote, if you have a Substack or anything, or if not, I have your Twitter handle down in the description.
Yeah, my Twitter is Robert Freid, Comrade Dimitri 101 on Twitter, and then my YouTube channel is also called Robert Freid. And yeah, that's about it. I mean, I don't really have a whole lot. I've been trying to stay off social media lately, so I don't have.
Do you want to send me your YouTube link in the private chat? That way I can put it up for
sure. Yeah,
in the description.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, I'm not like a huge attention whore, so I'm not really.
No, but I mean, for every guest I have on, I give them the opportunity to make more people aware of what they are and what they do.
Oh, yeah,
I think every perspective that I can get in these circles are very, very valuable.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But yeah, no, but yeah, I am thankful that you came on. I'm glad that we could have this discussion, and now I can copy that YouTube link and I can put it in there in the description so everyone can go and give your stuff a watch and follow you on Twitter for your takes.
Yeah, I don't really I've been wanting to post more videos. I haven't been posting a whole lot of videos, but yeah, I've been wanting to actually get my YouTube channel really started up lately.
Well, I think that we would all appreciate an anthropological and a historical perspective on what you study.
Oh yeah, definitely. And yeah.
Well, to everyone who is watching this later, whether you're a YouTube member or subscribe, start back, or just a wonderful subscriber, if you enjoy this kind of content, by all means, I would greatly appreciate it if you like and share it, because that's the only way that the algorithm is ever going to catch a right-winger up there on the channel. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at 2bprudential. And if you really, really want to like my work, by all means, go to the subscribe star link in the description and help me pay for my medication without dipping into my salary. I'll see you all in the next video, everybody. Be prudent and take care.